I would like to talk about freedom of religion in the United States of America. And just let me give you a background. Of course, as an ordained minister and general superintendent of the United Pentecostal Church International, certainly I have a great love for religious freedom and believe that we should be free to practice our beliefs. I'd also like to say that I was trained as a lawyer. I went to the University of Texas Law School, which is one of the top 10 law schools in the nation, and I was in the top 3% of the class, a member of the Texas Law Review, and in constitutional law was one of my favorite classes. In fact, I received an award for the top grade of the class. And I only mention this to say I have more than a passing interest and more than a passing knowledge of constitutional law. Now, I'm an inactive member of the State Bar of Texas, so I haven't been directly involved in legal research for many years. But I've tried to keep up with this area of the law because it is so important to us as Christians. So I'd like to make a few comments. Religious freedom is established in the U.S. Constitution in the First Amendment, and I think that's appropriate because religious freedom is really the foundation of all other rights that we have as human beings. The Declaration of Independence makes it very clear that rights do not come from government, but rights come from God. Therefore, they're unalienable. In other words, you cannot take them away. Government may trample on those rights, but government has no right to take away these basic human rights. And the first one is religious freedom, because that deals with freedom of conscience. That deals with the personal relationship between a human being and his or her creator. If you take away religious freedom, then freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, all the other First Amendment freedoms will fall like dominoes. So I believe it's very important in our day to defend religious freedom. Now, there are two aspects of religious freedom that are mentioned in the First Amendment. That is, the government will not establish a religion. The government will not officially endorse or support one religion above the others. And we believe that because if the government promoted one religion, it probably would not be the apostolic Pentecostal message. Even if it did, the very fact that government is supporting it and promoting it would tend to discredit it in the eyes of many others. So we're much better off with the government staying out of the religion business altogether and letting us have freedom to promote our message. We'll accomplish more by the power of God, by the preaching of the Word and the work of the Holy Spirit than we would with government support. So we're not asking the government to support our religious faith instead of others. We're asking the government to get out of the religious business altogether. And that's what the Establishment Clause does. The second clause is the Free Exercise Clause. And that means in America we have freedom to exercise our own religion. This includes absolute freedom of belief. You cannot put someone in jail because of what they believe. Unfortunately, we see encroachment of this liberty. It's pronounced in Europe, even in Canada, whereas if you take a stand, for example, against homosexual behavior, then you can actually be fined if you make these statements publicly. In America, at least so far, that's impossible because the First Amendment has always been understood to mean you have an absolute right to say and believe what you want to believe because of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of press. But we've got to be careful because under the guise of hate speech or hate crime, it's possible that thoughts could be deemed criminal or expressions could be deemed criminal. And we've got to stand against any reinterpretation of our fundamental rights. Now, free exercise also means that great deference should be paid whenever people are acting out of their religious convictions. However, this right is not absolute. For example, if someone says, well, I believe in human sacrifice, the law would say, too bad. You can believe it, but you can't practice it. If you do, you'll go to jail or you could even be executed. Likewise, if your religion says I can use drugs, illegal drugs, or I can abuse animals or something like that, the law can intervene and say, no, you cannot. You can believe it, but you can't practice it because it's contrary to public policy. But whenever the law steps in like that, under current interpretation of the law, the government cannot single out a religion or a religious practice. So, for example, it cannot say, well, religious people cannot abuse animals, but everybody else can. Or religious people cannot use certain drugs, but everybody else can. It can't single out a religious practice. It has to have a neutral law that applies to everyone, that doesn't have an intent to discriminate against religion, but because it's a public policy, it might affect religion, somebody's religious practices. The other thing is that when there is a religious practice involved, the government must use the least restrictive means of fulfilling its own public policy. So where there is a compelling state interest that overrides this practice of religion, the government still has to give deference to choose the least restrictive alternative to fulfill its legitimate purpose. So the government is not supposed to come in heavy-handed and say, we have an interest here, so we're just going to wipe away your religious practices totally. It has to say, no, we have a strong public policy interest in our nation. We're not trying to restrict religion, but your religion interferes with our strong public policy. Therefore, we're going to try to have the least impact on your religion that we can, and yet fulfill the policy.